In this video, we're going to continue our exploration of simple linear regression, and we're going to look at a few things to watch out for when you're doing regression analysis. So first we'll start with an example where we have what's called an outlier. And so this example, it's based on the the percentage of white in the tail feathers of a particular type of bird at different latitudes in California. And let me just run the code and show you the graph so that I can tell you what's going on. So our response variable is the percent of white in the tail feathers, and then the predictive variable in this case is the latitude in degrees north. And so our whole data set are all the points, including this red one down here. And I'll tell you why I've colored it red in a second. But think about all these points together. If I fit a simple linear regression model to all of the points, I get the red regression line here. So the line is not completely horizontal, but it's not far off from being horizontal. So what that's telling us is if there is a linear relationship between the response variable and the predictor variable, it's not a particularly strong one because my regression line is quite close to being horizontal. And I suspect that if I were to do a hypothesis test for the slope here, I probably wouldn't be able to reject the null hypothesis that the population slope is 0. But if you were to just kind of look at the plot and think about what's going on, ignoring this point down here, this red one, I'll just cover that up, there does appear to be a linear relationship between the variables, ignoring that point down there. And so if I actually exclude that red point from the data set and then fit a model to the remaining points, I get the black regression line here. So it's a steeper slope. It's capturing the linear association for the other points much better than the red line does. And so this is an example of one individual point having a really big effect on my analysis. If I include the point in the analysis, I get the red regression line. If I exclude that point, I get the black regression line. And so this is why it's always very important whenever you do a simple linear regression analysis to include a scatter plot of your data and put the regression line on it so you can see, is that regression line really capturing the relationship in the data, or is it maybe being overly influenced by a single point? The next question is what to do, and so that's a challenging question because it's not clear what we should do at this point. The first thing I would probably do is maybe I would go back and look at the data, maybe ask the researchers who collected the data, is this value correct? It doesn't seem to fit the pattern in the rest of the data, so maybe there's a mistake here. If you look into it and it's not a mistake, then you've got to consider the possibility that, well, maybe this represents some phenomenon that isn't represented by the other birds. Maybe there's something going on with this particular bird, and it's not shared by these other birds, and so that might raise other questions and other possible research areas to follow up on. So probably what I would do in this case is I would present two sets of results. I would say I've got question marks about this particular observation. If I include this observation in the data set, I get the red regression line. Here's its formula. The slope is not significant. I'm guessing here, but I'm guessing that it's not significant. Whereas if I exclude that observation, I get the black regression line, and here are the results, and I do get a significant slope. And I think it raises more questions than it answers when something like this happens. Okay, so that's one thing to look out for is an outlier, and an outlier technically in simple linear regression is when the response variable, the value for the response variable, is very different from what we might predict. Okay, let's look at another example. So this example, let's see what this is all about. Desert fish. Let's look at a graph. Oh yeah. So here I've got a scatter plot showing the relationship between the number of fish species, that's the response variable, and the surface area of 20 desert pools. So presumably, as the size of the pools increases, the number of species goes up. And so naively, if we were to simply, here's my data, hold on a second, I wanted to just show the whole data set. Okay, so here's my data, and I might go, okay, I've got my data, I know how to fit a simple linear regression model. I'll fit a simple linear regression model with number of fish species as the response variable and the pool area as the predictor variable, and I get my formula of my equation, and that's the red line here. And if you'd not looked at this graph, you would be none the wiser. You would have your equation and you would merrily go on your way, and you'd think everything was fine. But as soon as you draw this graph, you know that what you've done is pointless, completely pointless, because that red line does not track the trend in the data at all. The trend in the data, so just focusing on the black points, that's the data. Ignore the red line now. This curved line here is it's a smoothing method that is able to pick up nonlinear trends. And it's clear that as the area increases, the number of species goes up really quickly, and then it levels off. And that's what we should be modeling, not this straight line that just goes up at the same rate and completely misses the actual trend in the data. So what to do? Well, there's many possible things that could work here, but it turns out that using transformations on the two variables actually works quite well. So if I calculate the log of the number of species and the log of the area, and then draw this plot, I do get a nice linear relationship. And so if I was to fit a simple linear regression model to these transformed variables, I would have quite a successful model, because that black line does capture the trend reasonably well. I mean, it's not flawless by any means, but it certainly does a better job than the red line does when we're looking at the untransformed data. As another example, let's look at this data set here. So this data set is from the cap color of offspring on that of their parents for blue tits, which is a British bird. So what I'm going to do is fit a simple linear regression model, and then I'm going to calculate the residuals from that regression model, and then I'm going to draw what's known as a residual plot. And simple linear regression relies on a number of assumptions. So those assumptions, let me just read them. So at each value of x, the predictor variable, there is a population of possible y values, response values, whose mean lies on the true regression line. That's the first assumption. Second assumption, at each value of x, the distribution of possible y values is normal. Third assumption, the variance of the y values is the same at all values of x. And then the fourth assumption, at each value of x, the y measurements represent a random sample from the population of possible y values. So one way to assess those assumptions is to create a plot like this, which is known as a residual plot. And if the assumptions hold, what we should see in this residual plot is a roughly symmetric cloud of points above and below the horizontal line at 0. There's the horizontal line at 0, with a higher density of points close to the line than far away from the line. Okay, that seems to be supported by this residual plot. Next, we need there to be little noticeable curvature as we move from left to right along the x-axis. Okay, so as I trace along the x-axis and think about the pattern in the points, I ought to see little noticeable curvature in the patterns that I see, and I think that's the case here. There's nothing much I can see there that's worrying me. And then finally, again, as I trace along the plot from left to right, there should be approximately equal variance of points above and below the 0 line at all values of x. And that seems to be supported as well. Okay, let me show you an example where that's not the case. So in this example, so this is a study of firing rates of cockroach neurons on temperature. And this is the residual plot for the simple linear regression model. And if I think about assessing the assumptions, have I got a roughly symmetric cloud of points above and below the horizontal line at 0? Yeah, actually, I think I do. Is there little noticeable curvature as we move from left to right along the axis? Yeah, I'm not seeing super strong non-linear curved trends there. But it's when I come to the last one that I've got an issue. Approximately equal variance of points above and below the line at all values of x. Well, that's not the case. At low values of x, so temperatures from here up to here, so what is that, from like maybe 12 up to 22, the residuals are very variable. Okay, they're spread across almost the entire range, whereas at temperatures higher than 22, so 23 or higher, the variability of the residuals gets much smaller. So I don't have approximately equal variance of points above and below the line at all values of x. So that means one of the assumptions is not supported by my residual plot, because one of the assumptions was that the variance of y values is the same at all values of x, and that wouldn't be supported by this residual plot. So anytime you do a simple linear regression analysis, it's always worthwhile to create some residual plots and just do a quick visual assessment of those assumptions, and if the assumptions seem to be supported by the residual plot, then that gives you more confidence that the model that you're fitting is reasonable. If you see a residual plot, say like this one, where one or more of the assumptions is not supported, then you need to put the brakes on and go, well, hold on a minute, I'm not sure that this model is suitable here, and so maybe I need to take a different approach to analyzing this data. Okay, so that's a discussion of some possible pitfalls to look out for when you're doing simple linear regression. In the next video, we'll think a little bit more about these ideas and also talk about some transformations that can often remedy problems that come up.